For years, mountain monsters felt like controlled chaos, folklore, fear, and brotherhood wrapped in Appalachian darkness. Viewers laughed, jumped, and followed the Ames team deep into places most people would never dare to step. But behind the shouting and the humor, something far heavier was happening. One man on that team saw it before anyone else. Joe Huckleberry Lott wasn't just muscle or comic relief. He was the protector, the one who noticed when the woods went quiet for the wrong reasons, and according to Huckleberry, there was a season of mountain monsters so disturbing it was never allowed to air. Not delayed, not re-edited, buried, footage taken, contracts rewritten, silence enforced. What they encountered deep in the West Virginia wilderness wasn't entertainment anymore, and the moment it appeared on camera, everything changed. Subscribe now, because what Huckleberry eventually revealed suggests the real monster wasn't what they were hunting. It was the truth the network didn't want anyone to see. To most viewers of mountain monsters, Joe Huckleberry Lott was the steady presence in the chaos. While the rest of the Ames team shouted, joked, and charged headfirst into the woods, Huckleberry stayed grounded. He spoke less, he moved deliberately, and when things started to feel out of control, eyes always drifted toward him. Not because he was the loudest, but because he was the one people trusted when fear stopped being fun. Off camera, that role went even deeper. Joe Huckleberry Lott wasn't just the team's muscle or security, he was its stabilizer. Crew members have described him as the person who checked everyone's mental state after long nights, the one who stepped in when tempers flared or panic set in. When a hunt went sideways, it was Huckleberry who made the call on whether they pushed forward or pulled back. That authority didn't come from the show. It came from years of shared experience and trust. As mountain monsters grew in popularity, that responsibility only increased. The stakes rose, locations became more remote, shoots lasted longer, and the line between performance and genuine danger blurred. While viewers saw the same familiar format, those on set noticed changes in Huckleberry long before the audience did. He grew quieter between takes. He stopped joking back. Sometimes he'd wander off alone after filming, standing at the edge of the tree line as if listening for something no one else could hear. What unsettled the crew most wasn't fear, it was recognition. Huckleberry didn't act like a man imagining threats. He acted like someone who had seen patterns repeat. When others laughed things off, he didn't. When producers encouraged bigger reactions, he resisted. On one occasion, after a teammate joked about provoking whatever they were hunting, Huckleberry cut him off sharply. He warned that you don't challenge something unless you're ready for it to respond. The mood shifted instantly. That wasn't a line, it was conviction. By the mid-2010s, Huckleberry had become the emotional center of the team, and also the first to sense that the hunts were no longer just stories. Something had changed in the woods, and whatever it was, he felt it before anyone else realized the show was heading toward a breaking point. By the time Mountain Monsters reached its later seasons, something subtle but important had shifted. On the surface, the format was the same: folklore, tracking, night hunts, adrenaline, laughter. But for those paying close attention, the tone had darkened. The humor didn't land the same way. Reactions felt less exaggerated. Fear stopped feeling performative and started looking real. Crew members later admitted that the woods themselves felt different. Locations that once carried an adventurous edge now came with a heaviness that lingered even during daylight. Sounds didn't behave normally. Nights felt longer. Equipment failures became more frequent, not catastrophic, but persistent enough to raise concern. Batteries drained faster than expected. Audio picked up interference where none should exist. These weren't moments played up for drama. Many never made it to air. Joe Huckleberry Lott noticed the change immediately. He began urging the team to slow down, to stop shouting blindly into the forest, to treat certain areas with caution. What unsettled others wasn't that he was scared. It was that he seemed focused, as if he recognized something familiar in the way events were unfolding. He spoke less during filming and more during quiet moments, warning that provoking the unknown wasn't entertainment once it started reacting. There were moments when jokes died mid-sentence, times when someone would laugh only to realize no one else was smiling. On more than one occasion, filming stopped not because of weather or technical issues, but because the mood simply collapsed. The woods went quiet in a way that felt intentional. That kind of silence doesn't translate well to television, so it was usually cut, but those who were there remembered it. Fans began noticing the shift too. Online discussions pointed out that the team seemed more tense, less carefree. Huckleberry, once the reassuring presence, looked burdened. His eyes scanned tree lines instead of cameras. He flinched at sounds he would have ignored years earlier. Viewers chalked it up to age or exhaustion. They didn't know the crew was already discussing whether certain hunts should continue at all. Behind the scenes, there were quiet disagreements. Some wanted to push harder, escalate, deliver bigger moments. Others worried they were crossing from investigation into something reckless. Huckleberry was firmly in the latter camp. He believed the woods were no longer reacting to noise or movement, they were reacting to intent. By the time production began planning what would become the unaired season, the question wasn't how to make the show bigger. It was whether the show was still in control of what it was chasing. And for the first time, that answer didn't feel like yes. The investigation that would eventually vanish from public record didn't begin with a title, a creature name, or even a clear destination. Internally, production notes for Mountain Monsters referred to it only as a numbered site, a remote stretch of Appalachian forest in southern West Virginia, far from towns, paved roads, or reliable communication. That alone was unusual. Most hunts were anchored in local legends with names people recognized. This one came with warnings instead of stories. From the start, locals were reluctant to speak on camera. A few would talk off the record, lowering their voices, refusing to give exact location. They mentioned lights drifting along ridgelines, animals found in places that didn't make sense, and a feeling that certain areas of the woods didn't want people lingering after dark. None of it fit clean folklore. It sounded more like avoidance than myth-making. The Ames team arrived expecting another difficult shoot. What they didn't expect was how quickly things felt wrong. Weather forecasts stopped matching reality. Clear nights turned into sudden fog. Winds shifted direction without warning. Electronics behaved inconsistently. Equipment that had worked for years began malfunctioning within hours of setup. These weren't dramatic failures, just enough disruption to make seasoned crew members uneasy. Joe Huckleberry Lot reacted differently than the rest. He didn't joke about it. He didn't brush it off. He started setting stricter boundaries, positioning cameras carefully, insisting on quieter movement through certain areas. When asked why, he gave the same answer repeatedly. Something about this place didn't feel random. By the first night, the mood had shifted completely. The forest felt compressed, as if sound couldn't travel the way it should. Small noises echoed too clearly. Larger sounds felt muffled. Jeff's thermal equipment picked up inconsistent heat signatures that appeared, moved unnaturally fast, then vanished before anyone could get eyes on them. Each time the team moved to investigate, the area went dead. Physical signs followed. Deep markings appeared on gear left unattended overnight. Not scratches from animals, straight, deliberate impressions that didn't match claws or tools. No one could explain how they'd been made without waking half the camp. Huckleberry stopped sleeping altogether, choosing instead to pace the perimeter until sunrise, watching the tree line as if expecting it to change shape. By the end of the first week, they had more footage than expected, and far less certainty. Whatever they were tracking wasn't behaving like an animal reacting to bait or noise. It was avoiding patterns, studying movement, adjusting. The realization settled quietly among the crew. This wasn't a hunt unfolding, it was an encounter waiting to happen. By the second week, the investigation no longer followed any familiar rhythm. Night hunts stretched longer. Movement was slower, quieter. The Ames team spoke in short sentences, conserving energy and attention. What unsettled everyone was not what they were seeing. It was what the equipment was reacting to before their eyes could catch up. On multiple nights, thermal cameras registered large heat signatures that appeared abruptly at the edge of frame, moved against the slope in ways that defied natural gait, then vanished as soon as someone tried to reposition. For Joe Huckleberry Lot, this was the breaking point between curiosity and caution. He began insisting that every camera stay rolling, even during downtime. He double-checked battery packs, repositioned audio recorders, and warned the crew not to wander off alone. This wasn't fear-driven panic. It was preparation. He behaved like someone who believed the encounter was inevitable and imminent. One night, while reviewing footage in the field tent, the team noticed something subtle but alarming. In several clips, background distortion appeared between trees, not as a clear figure but as a warping of space, like heat haze where no heat source existed. Frame-by-frame playback made it worse. The distortion moved independently of wind. It paused, it adjusted, and in one clip, it appeared to react when a camera operator shifted position, bending slightly as if tracking the lens. No one spoke for several seconds after that playback. There was no excitement, no celebration, just silence. One crew member later said that moment felt like crossing a line. The instant they realized they weren't documenting folklore anymore. They were documenting presence. Over the next 2 nights, activity intensified. Heavy movement circled the camp after midnight, slow and deliberate. Audio picked up low-frequency sounds that didn't register as animal calls. They weren't loud. They were close. Traps were triggered without activating sensors. Bait disappeared without disturbance to surrounding ground. And every time the team tried to recreate conditions for better footage, the activity stopped completely. The cameras kept rolling, though, and they caught things no one noticed in real time. Shadows that moved without a source, brief frame drops accompanied by audio distortion, and moments where the forest itself seemed to swallow light. Huckleberry stopped allowing jokes on mic. He warned that whatever they were dealing with didn't respond to noise, it responded to attention. By the end of that stretch, no one wanted to review footage alone, and the unspoken understanding among the crew was clear. Whatever had been watching them now knew it was being watched back. The final hunt didn't begin with urgency, it began with restraint. By that point, everyone understood that rushing only seemed to make things worse. The plan was simple: split into pairs, cover more ground quietly, and let the equipment do the work. Mountain monsters had used this method dozens of times before, but this night felt different the moment they stepped away from camp. Joe Huckleberry Lot paired off and moved upslope with a handheld camera and audio recorder. The forest was unnaturally still. No insects, no wind. Even their footsteps sounded muted, like the ground was absorbing noise instead of reflecting it. Minutes passed without incident. Then the radios began to crackle. At first, it was just interference, a low hiss. Then a voice cut through. Huckleberries. One word. Movement. What followed wasn't static in the usual sense. It was uneven, pulsing, as if something was breathing directly into the microphone. The sound lasted far too long to be interference. The rest of the team moved toward the signal immediately, calling out with no response. When they reached Huckleberry's location, they found him standing perfectly still, camera raised but unmoving, staring uphill between two trees. The camera was still recording. What it captured wouldn't fully register until later. A faint vertical shape stood just beyond the tree line, tall, indistinct, its outline shimmering as though the air around it was bending. It didn't advance. It didn't flee. It tilted slightly, the way a person might study something unfamiliar. Huckleberry whispered, almost involuntarily, "It's looking at us." Then it vanished. Not by running or retreating, it simply ceased to be there. In that instant, every device shut down. Cameras, audio, thermal, radios, total blackout. When power returned, the time codes had jumped forward 9 minutes. No one could account for what happened during that gap. No one remembered moving. No one remembered speaking. Back at camp, the confusion turned to unease. Several traps had been tripped without triggering sensors. Bait was gone, dragged away without tracks. Buck was shaking uncontrollably, repeating the same sentence under his breath. It was behind us. The footage was reviewed once in silence, then again, more carefully. No celebration followed, no relief. Huckleberry didn't look relieved either. He looked shaken, not excited, not triumphant. Afraid. Later, he would say the thing that haunted him most wasn't how it moved, it was that it seemed to decide. The morning after the final hunt felt wrong in a way no one could name. There was no adrenaline hangover, no relief, no joking about what they'd captured. The footage sat untouched for hours. When it was finally reviewed in the field tent, the mood turned heavy. No one argued about what they were seeing. They argued about what it meant. This wasn't something that could be cut into a dramatic episode and moved past next week. Within a day, production was halted. Not paused, halted. Calls were made that the Ames team wasn't included in. Then, unfamiliar men arrived at the site, not regular producers or editors, but outsiders carrying clipboards and sealed cases. They identified themselves vaguely and asked for everything: cameras, drives, batteries, backups, all of it. Joe Huckleberry Lot refused at first. One camera in particular. He said it wasn't ready to be seen, that it needed contact. The response was immediate and cold: hand it over or risk removal from the show entirely. The decision was made for him. The camera was taken from his bunk while he was away. What followed felt less like television and more like containment. Every storage device was logged, sealed, and packed without explanation. No one said where it was going. No one said when it would return. By that evening, the team was instructed to suspend all filming pending review. Within days, updated non-disclosure agreements arrived, far stricter than anything they'd signed before. For the first time in its history, Mountain Monsters didn't just stop production. It vanished from the schedule. Calls went unanswered. Paychecks stalled. And slowly, the realization set in. This wasn't about editing choices or network tone. Whatever was on those tapes had crossed a line. Huckleberry understood it before anyone else said it out loud. The show wasn't being delayed, it was being erased. Once the footage was taken, the strangest part wasn't what happened next. It was what didn't happen. There was no follow-up meeting, no explanation from the network, no reassurance that production would resume. Mountain Monsters simply went quiet. Calls from the Ames team went unanswered. Emails disappeared into silence. The momentum that had carried the show for years stopped overnight. Within weeks, the strain began to fracture the crew. The brotherhood that had survived years of long nights and dangerous hunts started to thin under pressure. Some members withdrew completely, avoiding contact and refusing to talk about the trip. Others tried to move on, hoping the silence meant the footage would eventually resurface. But Joe Huckleberry Lot couldn't let it go. He believed what they encountered didn't stay in the woods. He began connecting dots, reports from locals near the filming area describing similar distortions, odd equipment failures, and sudden stillness in the forest. The stories echoed what the team had experienced almost word for word. To Huckleberry, it felt like confirmation. Whatever they had filmed wasn't bound to one place. Legal pressure followed, quietly at first, then directly. New warnings made it clear that any mention of the unaired season, the location, or the footage would trigger immediate action. Silence wasn't suggested. It was enforced. Faced with real consequences, most of the crew chose to walk away. That decision broke something. The show wasn't just canceled. The shared purpose that had defined the Ames team dissolved with it. To the public, the disappearance of mountain monsters looked routine. To those who lived it, it felt deliberate. Huckleberry later said the hardest part wasn't losing the show. It was realizing that the evidence they fought to capture, proof that they weren't just chasing legends, had been taken out of their hands. And once that happened, the hunt wasn't theirs anymore. For years after mountain monsters vanished, Joe Huckleberry Lott kept his distance. He still appeared at conventions, still smiled for photos, but anyone who asked about the missing season was met with a polite deflection. To the public, it looked like loyalty to contracts or respect for the network. To those who knew him, it felt more like caution. That silence finally cracked years later, and not in a way anyone expected. Huckleberry agreed to appear on a small paranormal podcast with a limited audience. There was no hype, no marketing push, no warning that anything significant would be said. At first, the conversation stayed safe. Memories, laughs, old hunts. Then the hosts asked about the season that never aired. Huckleberry didn't deny it. He paused. His voice dropped. He confirmed that an entire investigation existed that viewers had never seen. He didn't name the location or describe the footage directly, but his language changed. He said what they captured wasn't something you edit around. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was wrong. When one host laughed nervously, Huckleberry stopped him cold. He said the thing they encountered didn't behave like an animal reacting to bait or noise. It reacted to intention. It moved with awareness, and it knew they were there before they knew it was watching. That wasn't fear speaking. It was certainty. Within hours, clips from the interview spread online. Fans dissected every word. But less than 2 days later, the entire episode disappeared. Not just one upload, every version, across every platform. The hosts later claimed they'd received legal notices demanding immediate removal. Huckleberry never commented on the takedown. He never returned for a follow-up. After that, his online presence went dark. Social media pages stopped updating. Messages from fans went unanswered. Those close to him said he became more guarded, more withdrawn. He still believed the footage mattered, but he also believed there were consequences for pushing too hard. For many fans, that brief interview changed everything. It confirmed what rumors had hinted at for years. The lost season wasn't shelved for creative reasons. It was buried, and the fact that even a careful, measured admission triggered immediate silence suggested something far more serious than a canceled TV show. Huckleberry hadn't broken his silence to tell a story. He'd broken it to issue a warning. In the years since that brief confession, Joe Huckleberry Lott has avoided the subject almost entirely. When asked about the missing season of mountain monsters, he redirects, smiles politely, and changes the topic. Those closest to him say it isn't fear of contracts anymore, it's acceptance. Whatever happened in those woods, he believes it can't be undone by exposure. Occasionally, fragments resurface. A grainy clip, a whispered line. Each vanishes as quickly as it appears. Fans argue over authenticity, but the pattern never changes. Appearance, removal, silence. Huckleberry has acknowledged none of it. The only statement he's repeated, quietly and without drama, is that some things aren't meant to be chased once they've been seen. The show didn't end with answers. It ended with a boundary. According to Huckleberry, the real danger wasn't the figure in the trees. It was what followed when the evidence was taken away and everyone was told to forget. Mountain Monsters didn't conclude with closure. It concluded with a warning. If the truth disappears that easily, maybe it was never meant to be entertainment at all. Jacob Buck Lowe was the youngest hunter on Mountain Monsters, the fan favorite who learned everything from the legendary Trapper. But when the cameras stopped rolling and Trapper died, Buck's life took a turn nobody saw coming. What happened next reveals the dark reality of what happens to reality TV stars after the fame disappears. Tonight, we're uncovering the truth about Buck's life after Mountain Monsters, and it's not what you think. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. In 2013, a young hunter from the heart of West Virginia stepped into the spotlight and changed the face of cryptid hunting on television forever. Jacob "Buck" Lowe joined the cast of Mountain Monsters as one of the original AIMS team members and immediately stood out for one crucial reason. He was the youngest member of the crew by a significant margin, while the rest of the team consisted of grizzled, weathered Appalachian veterans who had spent decades trekking through those ancient mountains. Buck brought youthful energy, raw enthusiasm, and a hunger to prove himself that viewers found instantly compelling. His personality created a perfect contrast with the older hunters. Where they were cautious and methodical, Buck was impulsive and eager. Where they relied on decades of experience, Buck relied on instinct and adrenaline, and fans absolutely loved him for it. He became the relatable entry point for younger audiences, the guy who asked the questions viewers were thinking, who reacted with genuine excitement when something unexplainable happened in the darkness. But behind the scenes, the reality of filming Mountain Monsters was far more grueling than most viewers ever realized. The shooting schedule was absolutely brutal, with the team often spending entire nights in freezing temperatures, hiking through treacherous terrain, setting elaborate traps, and staging dramatic confrontations with creatures that may or may not have actually been there. Like many reality shows, there was constant pressure to deliver compelling television, to create moments that would keep audiences coming back week after week. For Buck, being the youngest meant working twice as hard to earn respect, to prove he belonged among these legendary hunters, to show he wasn't just the kid who got lucky with a TV contract. The physical toll, the mental exhaustion, the strange liminal space between reality and performance that defines all reality television. Buck was living it all while still in his 20s, and the cracks were already beginning to form beneath the surface, even if nobody could see them yet. One of the most compelling dynamics on Mountain Monsters was the relationship between Buck and the team's legendary leader, John "Trapper" Tice. For many fans watching at home, Buck felt like the spiritual son of Trapper on screen, the younger hunter learning directly from an old-school Appalachian legend who had spent his entire life in those mountains. Trapper wasn't just the team leader. He was a father figure, a mentor, a living embodiment of Appalachian hunting culture and folklore traditions passed down through generations. And Buck absorbed everything Trapper had to teach: the way he tracked, the way he read signs in the forest, the way he approached the unknown with respect rather than just bravado. Their on-screen chemistry became one of the show's most powerful elements. Trapper would bark orders and Buck would execute them without hesitation. Trapper would share wisdom about the mountains and Buck would listen with genuine reverence. It created a narrative arc that felt authentic, even within the sometimes questionable reality TV framework. Viewers watched Buck grow from an eager young hunter into a more seasoned tracker under Trapper's guidance. But it's crucial to clarify something that has caused confusion among fans over the years. Trapper and Buck were not related by blood. They were not father and son in any biological sense. Their relationship was purely professional and mentorship-based, forged through years of working together in extremely challenging conditions. However, the bond they developed was clearly deep and meaningful, transcending typical co-worker relationships. For Buck, Trapper represented everything he aspired to become as a hunter and as a man. The respect was visible in every interaction, every conversation, every moment they shared on screen. And when Trapper's health began to decline in later seasons, that bond would be tested in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. The foundation of Buck's entire experience on Mountain Monsters was built on Trapper's leadership, and when that foundation began to crumble, everything else would start falling apart as well. As Mountain Monsters progressed through its later seasons, viewers began noticing something troubling. Trapper's appearances became less frequent, his energy noticeably diminished, his usual commanding presence fading gradually. Behind the scenes, the truth was becoming unavoidable. Trapper was dealing with serious health issues that were progressively limiting his ability to participate in the grueling filming schedule. The show tried to work around his declining condition, giving him less physically demanding roles, allowing him more rest between shoots, but the reality was clear to everyone involved. The man who had been the heart and soul of AIMS was slowly slipping away. Then in December 2019, the news that everyone had been dreading finally came. John "Trapper" Tice passed away, leaving an enormous void in the show, in the team, and in the hearts of fans who had followed his adventures for years. The announcement devastated the Mountain Monsters community. Tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow cast members shared emotional statements about losing their friend, their leader, their brother in the woods. But for Buck specifically, losing Trapper hit differently. While we can only speculate about the depth of his personal grief, it seems almost certain that this wasn't just a TV moment for him. This was the loss of a mentor who had shaped his entire adult life, who had taught him not just how to hunt, but how to carry himself as an Appalachian man. For Buck, who had spent years in those dark woods by Trapper's side, learning his methods, absorbing his wisdom, building a relationship that went far beyond scripted television, that loss was almost certainly deeply personal and profoundly painful. Grief has a way of amplifying every other struggle in a person's life, and for someone already navigating the unstable world of reality television, the death of Trapper likely represented more than just losing a colleague. It meant losing the anchor that had kept everything together, the steady presence that had made all the chaos and uncertainty worthwhile. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons, building a dedicated cult following of cryptid enthusiasts, Appalachian culture fans, and people who simply enjoyed watching a group of colorful characters hunt impossible creatures through dark forests. But like many reality shows, it ended somewhat abruptly in 2020, leaving viewers with unresolved cliffhangers and unanswered questions about the team's ultimate fate. For the cast members, the sudden ending meant facing an uncertain future. The regular paychecks stopped. The visibility disappeared. The structure that had defined their lives for years simply vanished overnight. But Buck wasn't ready to let the legacy die. In late 2024 and into 2025, something unexpected happened. Buck, along with fellow AIMS members Huckleberry and Wild Bill, launched a new project that represented both a continuation and a reinvention. They created Sons of Appalachia, a YouTube-based series that would continue the cryptid hunting tradition while explicitly honoring Trapper's memory and the methods he had taught them. This wasn't a major network production with significant budgets and guaranteed viewership. This was 3 hunters with cameras, trying to keep the dream alive through sheer determination and passion for what they did. Sons of Appalachia represented a very different kind of challenge. Instead of fighting creatures in the woods, they were now fighting algorithms, competing for attention in an oversaturated digital landscape, trying to build an audience one video at a time. The production values were lower, the resources were limited, but the authenticity was arguably higher than it had ever been on cable television. For Buck, this new chapter meant taking control of his own narrative, steering his own career, and ensuring that everything Trapper had taught him wouldn't be forgotten. It was both inspiring and somewhat tragic. Here was a man who had achieved legitimate television fame, now reduced to scraping for views on YouTube just to continue doing what he loved. The transition from cable star to digital creator is a journey many have taken, but few talk about how difficult and humbling that fall can actually be. For many reality TV hunters in Appalachia, life after the cameras stop rolling can turn dark incredibly fast. This is a pattern we've seen repeated across countless shows and countless lives. Brief fame that feels enormous in the moment. Small paychecks that seem significant until they stop coming. No residuals, no royalties, no financial safety net for when the show ends. And then reality hits with brutal force. Bills that don't care about your television credits. Health issues that don't wait for your next opportunity. Mental health struggles that intensify in the silence after years of constant production chaos. And absolutely no support system from the networks that profited from your labor and your image. The entertainment industry has a long, documented history of chewing up working-class participants and spitting them out once their usefulness expires. This is especially true in reality television, where participants often lack the contracts, protections, and representation that scripted actors receive. They're not considered talent in the traditional sense. They're considered content, raw material to be extracted and exploited until the audience loses interest. For someone like Buck, coming from a small Appalachian community where opportunities are already limited, the whiplash of sudden fame followed by sudden obscurity can be psychologically devastating. We've seen this pattern over and over. The reality star who ends up broke, addicted, homeless, forgotten. The person who was on television one year and in a county jail the next. The familiar face who quietly disappears and nobody thinks to ask what happened to them. There is absolutely no public record that Jacob Lowe has gone through arrests, overdoses, or homelessness. But if he had, it would fit a well-known and well-documented pattern for reality TV's forgotten stars, particularly those from economically disadvantaged regions who were never given the tools or support to navigate sudden visibility and its inevitable disappearance. What we actually know about Jacob Buck Lowe's personal life is relatively limited, which is probably exactly how he prefers it. The documented facts paint a picture of a man deeply rooted in his Appalachian heritage. He's originally from West Virginia, born and raised in the mountains that would later become his television hunting grounds. His background before Mountain Monsters involved hunting and fishing, traditional Appalachian outdoor skills passed down through generations of mountain families. These weren't hobbies for Buck. They were survival skills, cultural practices, a way of life that connected him to the land and to his ancestors. In 2018, during the height of Mountain Monsters' popularity, Buck married Christine Stein, marking a significant personal milestone amid the chaos of reality television production. Marriage itself is challenging under normal circumstances, but balancing a marriage with the demands of a public persona and dangerous night shoots in the woods creates pressures that most couples never have to face. The constant travel, the physical danger, the strange schedule, the public scrutiny, the financial uncertainty. These are stressors that can destroy even the strongest relationships. Beyond these basic biographical facts, Buck has maintained relative privacy about his personal life, which makes sense given the invasive nature of reality television. He's not active on social media in the way many reality stars are, constantly sharing personal details and private moments. He's kept his family life, his struggles, his triumphs largely away from public view, and that restraint deserves respect. What we can say with certainty is that Buck represents a particular type of Appalachian man: tough, resourceful, connected to tradition, suspicious of outsiders, fiercely loyal to his community. These qualities made him compelling television, but they also make him someone who likely struggles with the performative aspects of modern fame. The constant need to share, to engage, to commodify every aspect of your life for public consumption. For someone raised in mountain culture where privacy and self-reliance are deeply valued, the demands of reality television and digital content creation probably feel fundamentally unnatural and exhausting. Here's where we need to be absolutely clear and honest about the limits of what can be verified about Buck's life. There is no verified public information that Jacob Buck Lowe spiraled into addiction after Mountain Monsters ended. There are no credible reports that he lived in his truck, homeless and desperate. There are no documented stays in recovery housing or rehabilitation facilities. These narrative elements, while they fit common patterns for reality television participants, are not confirmed aspects of Buck's actual life story and should not be presented or accepted as biographical fact. This distinction matters enormously. It's easy to construct a tragic narrative that feels plausible, that aligns with what we know happens to many people in similar circumstances, that creates compelling content. But plausibility is not the same as truth, and patterns are not the same as individual experience. Buck deserves to have his actual story told, not a fictionalized version that serves a predetermined narrative arc. What is absolutely real, however, is the environment Buck exists within. Appalachia's devastating opioid crisis is well documented and has destroyed countless lives across the region. The economic stress facing working-class communities throughout West Virginia and surrounding states is severe and worsening. The way reality television fame can magnify every existing crack in a person's life, turning manageable problems into catastrophic failures, is proven across countless examples. So while we don't know Buck's specific struggles, we know the context he's operating within is brutal. We know the pressures he's facing are real. We know that even if he's avoided the worst outcomes, he's almost certainly fought battles that the public will never see or understand. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Buck's relative privacy might indicate he's handling everything well, or it might indicate he's struggling privately. We simply don't know, and we shouldn't pretend we do. So what actually happened to Jacob Buck Lowe after Mountain Monsters? The documented facts tell a story that's less sensational, but perhaps more genuinely interesting than manufactured tragedy. Buck remained a main cast member through all 8 seasons of the show, never getting fired, never quitting, never disappearing mysteriously. He was there from the beginning in 2013 until the show's conclusion in 2020, a 7-year run that represents genuine consistency and professional commitment in the notoriously unstable world of reality television. Then, after a period of relative quiet following the show's cancellation, Buck resurfaced publicly as one of the 3 core members of Sons of Appalachia. Alongside Huckleberry and Wild Bill, he's now leading a new cryptid hunting series that launched in 2025, explicitly designed designed to continue Trapper's legacy and keep Appalachian monster hunting traditions alive for a new generation of viewers. In one sense, what happened to Buck is tragic, but in a different way than typical reality TV horror stories. This is the tragedy of diminishment rather than destruction. A beloved cable television star, someone who appeared in millions of homes, who had genuine fame and recognition, now reduced to fighting YouTube algorithms just to stay visible, trading network production budgets for whatever equipment they can afford, building audiences one subscriber at a time instead of inheriting established viewership. This is the reality for most television personalities once their show ends. The industry moves on instantly, viewers forget quickly, and yesterday's star becomes today's struggling content creator, desperately trying to remain relevant in an attention economy that has already moved past them. But there's also something admirable and resilient in Buck's journey. He didn't give up. He didn't fade away quietly. He didn't let Trapper's death or the show's cancellation end his connection to the work he clearly loves. He adapted, evolved, and found a new path forward, even if that path is harder and less glamorous than what came before. We don't know every detail of Jacob Buck Lowe's private life, and we shouldn't pretend we do. Speculation presented as fact helps no one and disrespects the actual human being behind the television character. But his journey from small-town hunter to cable TV star and then to YouTube survivor sits on top of a much bigger, darker story about what reality television does to people once the cameras go dark. The real monsters aren't cryptids hiding in Appalachian forests. The real monsters are systemic, addiction that preys on economically devastated communities, grief that compounds when you lose mentors and father figures, guilt over not living up to expectations, not capitalizing on opportunities, not becoming what everyone said you could be. The entertainment industry's exploitation of working-class people for profit without providing long-term support. Buck's story, whatever its specific details, represents thousands of similar stories. Reality TV participants used and discarded. Appalachian communities strip-mined for content the same way they've been strip-mined for coal. People whose humanity gets reduced to narrative arcs and clickable content. If there's a lesson here, it's about maintaining skepticism toward the reality television industry's promises and practices. It's about recognizing that every person we see on screen is a complete human being with struggles we'll never fully understand. It's about demanding better treatment and support for the people who create the content we consume. And it's about remembering that when we ask what happened to someone, we're asking about a real life, not just a story. Mountain Monsters has been off the air for years, but the real reason production stopped has finally been revealed. This wasn't a simple cancellation. It was a forced shutdown triggered by massive lawsuits, insurance investigations, and fraud allegations that Travel Channel desperately tried to hide. Former crew members are now exposing systematic evidence fabrication, cast members suing each other over stolen money, Trapper's family demanding justice. The truth buried for years is finally coming to light. Subscribe now, because what's being revealed about why Mountain Monsters really ended is darker than anyone imagined. Mountain Monsters production came to an abrupt halt in late 2022, but the circumstances surrounding that shutdown were deliberately obscured by Travel Channel and the production companies involved. What viewers were told was a mutual decision to end the series after a successful run was actually an emergency stoppage triggered by legal and financial crises that made continuing production impossible. Cast members arrived for what they believed would be a routine filming week in West Virginia, only to be informed via group text message that production was suspended indefinitely. No explanation was provided beyond vague references to business complications requiring immediate attention. Equipment trucks that had already arrived at filming locations were turned around and sent back to storage facilities. Local guides and property owners who'd been contracted for the week's investigations were told their services were no longer needed, with some never receiving the cancellation fees they'd been promised in their agreements. The chaos and lack of communication revealed a production in complete disarray, scrambling to shut down operations before information about brewing legal problems became public knowledge. Crew members who'd worked on Mountain Monsters for years were blindsided by the sudden shutdown. Camera operators, sound technicians, and production assistants who depended on the show for steady income found themselves unemployed without warning or severance packages. Several crew members later reported that their final paychecks bounced, requiring them to pursue legal action just to recover wages they'd already earned for work completed before the shutdown. The production company, Ping Pong Productions, stopped responding to phone calls and emails from cast cast and crew seeking information about when or if filming would resume. The silence suggested something far more serious than typical production delays or budget negotiations. Industry insiders began hearing rumors about lawsuits, insurance problems, and financial irregularities that had finally caught up with a show that had been operating under questionable practices for years. Travel Channel maintained public silence about the shutdown for months, refusing to confirm or deny whether Mountain Monsters would return. That silence was strategic. The network was consulting with legal teams about how to distance itself from the mounting scandals while minimizing its own liability exposure. Internal documents later revealed that Travel Channel executives had been aware of problematic practices on Mountain Monsters for years, but chose to ignore them as long as the show delivered acceptable ratings and revenue. The lawsuit that ultimately forced Mountain Monsters production to stop permanently was filed in October 2022 by a coalition of former crew members alleging a pattern of labor violations, unsafe working conditions, and systematic fraud that the production company had perpetrated over multiple seasons. The complaint, filed in West Virginia State Court, named Ping Pong Productions, Travel Channel's parent company Warner Bros. Discovery, and several individual producers as defendants. The allegations were damning and specific, backed by documentation including contracts, emails, text messages, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The lawsuit's central claims focused on wage theft. Crew members alleged they were consistently paid less than their contracts specified, forced to work excessive hours without overtime compensation, and denied meal penalties and other legally mandated benefits. Production assistants reported working 16-hour days during investigation filming, but being paid for only 8 hours, with producers threatening termination if they complained about the discrepancies. The complaint included detailed records showing systematic underpayment totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars across multiple crew members over several seasons. Even more explosive were allegations about evidence fabrication. Former production assistants provided sworn declarations describing how they were instructed to plant fake footprints, create artificial claw marks on trees, and place hair samples and scat that would later be discovered by the Ames team during investigations. One former employee detailed purchasing a gorilla costume from a Hollywood effects company and wearing it during night filming while cast members pretended to hunt for cryptids. The lawsuit included receipts for these purchases, emails discussing logistics of creating fake evidence, and text messages where producers explicitly acknowledged they were staging encounters because authentic cryptid activity couldn't be relied upon to provide enough dramatic content for each episode. The unsafe working conditions allegations focused on nighttime filming in dangerous terrain without proper safety equipment, inadequate medical support during remote investigations, and pressure on cast members to continue working despite injuries and health problems. The complaint specifically cited Buck's ATV accident and subsequent filming while he was clearly impaired by pain medications as examples of production prioritizing content over crew safety. Insurance fraud allegations claimed the production company had misrepresented the nature of filming activities to obtain coverage, then filed false claims when injuries occurred. The legal warfare among Mountain Monsters cast members revealed that the Ames team's apparent brotherhood was a facade hiding bitter disputes over money, credit, and control of the show's valuable intellectual property. The conflicts began even before Trapper's death, but escalated dramatically afterward as surviving cast members fought over who deserved what share of residual payments, merchandising revenue, and potential future earnings from the Mountain Monsters brand. Wild Bill filed a lawsuit in 2021 against the production company, claiming he was owed over $300,000 in unpaid residuals from streaming and international distribution that his contract entitled him to receive. His complaint alleged that Ping Pong Productions had deliberately hidden revenue streams and provided false accounting statements to avoid paying cast members their contractual shares. Wild Bill's attorneys subpoenaed financial records that revealed Mountain Monsters had generated millions in revenue from Netflix licensing, Amazon Prime streaming, and international sales that cast members had never been informed about or compensated for, despite contractual provisions entitling them to percentage participation. Buck and Jeff filed a joint lawsuit making similar claims, arguing they'd been systematically cheated out of earnings they'd legitimately earned through years of dangerous work on the show. Their case included allegations that producers had created shell companies to funnel revenue away from the main production entity, specifically to avoid contractual obligations to pay cast members. The legal filings exposed how production companies exploit reality television performers through complex corporate structures designed to minimize payments, while maximizing producer profits. Most bitter was the conflict between cast members themselves over merchandising rights. When Mountain Monsters merchandise, including t-shirts, hats, and collectibles, began generating significant revenue, disputes erupted about who owned the rights to the Ames Team brand, individual cast member images, and catchphrases used on the show. Huckleberry claimed he'd never signed away his image rights and demanded compensation for any merchandise featuring his likeness. Wild Bill and Jeff argued they had agreements with the production company that entitled them to merchandising percentages, while Buck contended that all cast members should share equally in merchandise revenue regardless of individual contracts. The legal battles became so contentious that cast members stopped speaking to each other entirely, destroying any possibility of the team reuniting for future productions, even if the show's other problems were resolved. The insurance investigation that ultimately made Mountain Monsters production legally impossible began after Buck's ATV accident, when the production company's liability insurer received a claim for medical expenses and disability payments related to his injuries. Insurance adjusters conducting routine investigation of the claim discovered discrepancies between what the production company had disclosed about filming activities versus what actually occurred during Mountain Monsters investigations. The insurer had been told filming involved outdoor recreation and nature documentation, with appropriate safety protocols, when in reality cast members were conducting dangerous nighttime investigations in rough terrain without adequate medical support, safety equipment, or supervision. Buck's accident triggered a comprehensive audit of all previous claims filed by Mountain Monsters production over multiple seasons. Investigators discovered a disturbing pattern. Numerous cast and crew members had filed injury claims related to filming, far exceeding the rate expected for the type of production activities the insurance company believed they were covering. Wild Bill's heart attack, various sprains and fractures among crew members, and multiple emergency room visits for injuries sustained during investigations revealed that Mountain Monsters was significantly more dangerous than the production company had disclosed when obtaining coverage. The insurance company determined that Ping Pong Productions had committed material misrepresentation by failing to disclose the true nature and risks of filming activities. They described Mountain Monsters as comparable to wildlife documentary production, when it actually involved cast members hiking dangerous terrain at night, building elaborate physical structures without engineering oversight, and engaging in activities that would require specialized stunt coordination and safety protocols if accurately disclosed. This misrepresentation potentially voided coverage for all previous claims and certainly terminated the policy going forward. Without insurance coverage, Mountain Monsters couldn't legally film. No location would grant permits, no network would authorize production, and cast and crew wouldn't work without liability protection. The production company attempted to obtain new coverage from other insurers, but once the previous carrier's investigation findings became known in the industry, no reputable insurance company would cover Mountain Monsters at any price. The few quotes the production company received for high-risk coverage required premiums so expensive they exceeded the show's entire production budget, making filming financially impossible even if they could find an insurer willing to take the risk. The legal action initiated by Trapper's family in 2023 opened a painful and complicated chapter in Mountain Monsters' troubled legacy, pitting Trapper's widow and children against the production company and network over how their deceased family member's image and legacy had been exploited since his death in 2019. The family's attorneys filed suit claiming that Ping Pong Productions had made verbal promises to compensate Trapper's estate for continued use of his image in episodes, promotional materials, and merchandise following his death, but had never formalized those promises in writing or made any payments. After Trapper died, Mountain Monsters continued airing episodes featuring him, released tribute merchandise with his image, and used his likeness extensively in marketing materials to promote new seasons, all generating revenue that his family never received a share of despite alleged promises from producers. The lawsuit argued this constituted both breach of contract based on oral agreements and violation of Trapper's publicity rights that passed to his estate upon death. West Virginia law provides that publicity rights, the right to control commercial use of one's name, image, and likeness, survive death and can be enforced by heirs for a specified period. Trapper's family claimed the production company had no legal right to continue profiting from his image without compensation to his estate, yet they'd done exactly that for over 3 years, while stonewalling the family's requests for accounting and payment. The emotional dimension of the lawsuit was heartbreaking. Trapper's widow described watching Mountain Monsters merchandise featuring her late husband being sold online and in stores while her family struggled financially with medical debt from his final illness and funeral expenses that the production company had promised to help with, but never did. She testified in depositions about producers calling after Trapper's death expressing condolences and assuring her the family would be taken care of, then subsequently ignoring her calls and emails when she attempted to discuss the promised financial support. The family's legal demands were substantial. They sought an accounting of all revenue generated from Trapper's image since his death, compensation for past use of his likeness, and an injunction preventing any future commercial use of Trapper's image until a licensing agreement with appropriate compensation was negotiated. The injunction threat was existential for Mountain Monsters because Trapper was the show's most beloved figure, and removing him from future content would eliminate much of the show's nostalgic appeal and marketability. The systematic evidence fabrication on Mountain Monsters was exposed in devastating detail when multiple former production assistants came forward with documentation proving that virtually every major cryptid encounter and evidence discovery on the show had been staged, scripted, or manipulated to create false drama. The whistleblowers provided attorneys with emails, text messages, invoices, and video footage that painted a picture of a production built entirely on deception from its earliest seasons through its final episodes. One former production assistant provided a detailed written statement describing his responsibilities during filming, which included arriving at investigation locations hours before cast members to plant evidence that would later be discovered during filming. He described creating fake Bigfoot footprints using carved wooden stamps, hanging tufts of synthetic hair purchased from costume suppliers on tree branches where they'd be noticed by cameras, and placing animal scat purchased from exotic animal facilities to suggest cryptid presence. The statement included photographs he'd secretly taken of these evidence-planting activities as insurance against potential legal liability, images that clearly showed production crew members staging the very evidence that would be presented as authentic discoveries. Email correspondence between producers and special effects companies revealed extensive discussions about creating creature costumes for night filming. One email chain detailed specifications for a realistic Bigfoot suit with appropriate movement characteristics for distance filming that cost over $12,000 to manufacture. The emails explicitly discussed how the costume would be used during Mountain Monsters investigations, with cast members pretending to encounter an actual cryptid. Invoices for the costume purchase and rental agreements for subsequent uses provided irrefutable documentation of premeditated fraud. Text messages between producers showed casual acknowledgement of the fabrication with jokes about manufacturing evidence, and discussions of which cast members were better at selling fake discoveries convincingly on camera. Perhaps most damning were behind-the-scenes video clips that production assistants had recorded on personal phones showing the reality of filming versus what appeared in broadcast episodes. One clip showed a dramatic Bigfoot encounter being filmed multiple times from different angles with a clearly visible person in a costume, followed by producers coaching cast members on how to react more convincingly for the final take that would air. The authenticity that made Mountain Monsters appealing was completely manufactured. Multiple property owners across West Virginia filed lawsuits against Mountain Monsters production, claiming trespassing, property damage, and filming without proper authorization or compensation. The legal actions revealed that producers had often filmed on private land without securing proper permits or landowner consent, relying on verbal agreements that were never formalized or compensated appropriately. One lawsuit filed by a family in Pocahontas County detailed extensive property damage caused by construction of elaborate traps and staging areas for investigations. The production had built wooden structures, dug pits, and cleared vegetation without permission, leaving behind debris and environmental damage when filming concluded. The property owners estimated repair costs exceeding $50,000 and sought compensation plus punitive damages for the unauthorized use of their land for commercial purposes. Another case involved a landowner who claimed producers had promised payment of $5,000 for location access, but never delivered the money despite filming multiple episodes on the property over 2 seasons. When the landowner attempted to collect, producers stopped responding to communications entirely. The lawsuit included text messages and emails documenting the original agreement and subsequent attempts to obtain payment. Most problematic were allegations that production had filmed in state parks and protected wilderness areas without proper permits from authorities. West Virginia Department of Natural Resources investigators discovered that Mountain Monsters had conducted filming in restricted areas built structures in protected habitats, and violated environmental regulations regarding waste disposal and vegetation disturbance. The state issued fines totaling over $100,000 and referred the matter for potential criminal prosecution. These land disputes created additional legal and financial burdens that made continuing production untenable, while also damaging relationships with West Virginia communities that had initially welcomed the show as promoting local cryptid folklore and tourism. Travel Channel's decision to permanently end Mountain Monsters came after executives conducted a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis revealing the show had become a massive liability that outweighed any remaining revenue potential. The network faced mounting legal exposure from multiple lawsuits naming Travel Channel alongside production companies as co-defendants. Even if the network prevailed in litigation, defending against claims would cost millions in legal fees while generating negative publicity that damaged Travel Channel's brand reputation with viewers and advertisers. Ratings for Mountain Monsters had declined significantly in later seasons as viewer skepticism about evidence authenticity increased, and the show failed to evolve beyond repetitive investigation formats. The loss of Trapper had hurt viewership substantially, and attempts to continue without him proved unsuccessful at retaining audience loyalty. Meanwhile, production costs had increased due to insurance complications, legal compliance requirements, and cast member salary demands, shrinking already marginal profit margins to unsustainable levels. Network executives recognized that Mountain Monsters had become associated with fraud allegations and exploitation controversies that conflicted with Travel Channel's efforts to position itself as a credible source of adventure and exploration content. The show's reputation for faking evidence undermined the network's other paranormal programming and created skepticism among viewers about whether any Travel Channel content could be trusted. The decision was made to cancel Mountain Monsters permanently, cease all future development, and gradually phase out the show from streaming platforms and syndication to distance the network from ongoing controversies. Travel Channel announced plans to develop new cryptid and paranormal investigation programming with stricter authenticity standards, enhanced safety protocols, and transparent disclosure about investigation methods to rebuild viewer trust damaged by Mountain Monsters' troubled legacy. Wild Bill attempts independent YouTube content with minimal success. Buck withdrew from public life, managing chronic pain and working occasional construction jobs. Jeff explores other paranormal projects, but Mountain Monsters' fraud reputation makes him unhireable. Huckleberry does small-scale cryptid hunting and convention appearances for modest income. The Ames team is fractured beyond repair, members no longer speaking due to legal disputes and personal betrayals. Mountain Monsters became a cautionary tale about reality TV exploitation rather than Appalachian folklore celebration. Trapper spent decades hunting creatures in the Appalachian mountains that most of the world refused to believe existed. He faced things in those woods that would have ended any other man's investigation before it started, and he went back every time. But in his final days, he said something about one investigation that he had never said about any other, that it scared him, that what the Ames team found during that hunt was something he was not prepared for. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Trapper revealed changes everything. John Trapper Tice was not a man who frightened easily. That is not a characterization built from the edited version of him that Mountain Monsters presented to its audience across 8 seasons of television. It is a characterization built from the full body of evidence of how he lived, the decades of hunting and fieldwork in some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States, the community relationships he maintained across generations of Appalachian families who trusted him with accounts of experiences they would never share with an outsider, and the operational culture he built within the Ames team that treated the phenomena they were hunting not as entertainment, but as a genuine and serious subject requiring genuine and serious investigation. Trapper grew up in the tradition of Appalachian mountain culture that understands the wilderness as a place inhabited by things that do not appear in any official catalog and that has never required outside validation for that understanding. The oral tradition of the region he operated in, the accounts passed down through families across generations describing creatures, presences, and phenomena in the mountains that defy the frameworks of mainstream biology and conventional experience, was not exotic folklore to Trapper. It was the informational context within which he had operated his entire adult life. He brought that context to Mountain Monsters, and it gave the show something that no production budget or network development process could manufacture: an investigator whose engagement with the subject was rooted in a relationship with the land and its people that predated cameras by several decades. The Ames team he assembled and led reflected that same quality. These were not paranormal television personalities recruited for their on-camera charisma. They were men with specific skills and specific backgrounds whose value to the investigation was practical rather than presentational. Trapper understood what each of them brought to the field and deployed those capabilities with the methodical deliberateness of someone who had been thinking about how to find these creatures long before anyone offered him a television show to do it. What made him exceptional as an investigator was not his willingness to go into dangerous terrain in the dark, though that willingness was genuine and documented across every season of the show. It was his ability to read the Appalachian landscape, the signs, the silences, the behavioral indicators that something significant had passed through an area or was currently present in it, with a fluency that came from a lifetime of immersion in that environment. He was not startled by the mountains. He was at home in them in a way that went beyond familiarity into something closer to belonging, which is why what he said about the investigation that scared him most carries a weight that nothing in the Mountain Monsters broadcast record approaches. A man who belonged to those mountains, who had spent decades in them encountering things that most people would find terrifying without ever describing himself as frightened, identified one investigation as the exception. That exception is what this video is about. The broadcast version of Mountain Monsters presented its investigations within a format that the paranormal television landscape had established: dramatic music, night vision sequences, constructed traps that almost but never quite caught anything, and a tone that balanced genuine fieldwork with the entertainment requirements of cable television. That format served the show well commercially across 8 seasons and built a dedicated audience that followed the Ames team through the full range of Appalachian cryptid territory. What it did not fully convey was the nature of what the investigation was actually accumulating beneath the surface of the broadcast material. The Appalachian mountain range is one of the oldest geological formations on the North American continent and one of the most consistently documented regions in the history of American cryptid and paranormal encounter reports. The density of the forest, the isolation of the communities embedded within it, and the cultural tradition of those communities, which has never treated anomalous experience as something requiring outside confirmation before it can be considered real, has produced a body of encounter testimony that stretches back further than any other comparable region in the country. Trapper understood this body of testimony not as a catalog of claims to be investigated, but as an accumulated record of observation from people who had been living alongside whatever inhabits those mountains for generations. The Ames team's investigations were, in this framing, not discovery operations. They were documentation operations. They were going into terrain where the local population already knew something was there, and attempting to produce evidence of sufficient quality to bring that knowledge into a form that the outside world could engage with. That distinction matters for understanding what the investigation that scared Trapper most actually produced. The show had documented compelling evidence across multiple seasons: physical signs of large unknown creatures, eyewitness accounts from credible local sources, audio recordings of vocalizations that did not match any known animal in the regional wildlife catalog. None of it had crossed the specific threshold that Trapper maintained in his own private assessment of the investigation's finding, the threshold between evidence that pointed towards something and evidence that confirmed it. The investigation he identified in his final days as the one that scared him most was the investigation that crossed that threshold, not because it produced better physical evidence than prior investigations, though what the cameras documented during that investigation exceeded anything the show had previously captured, but because of what the evidence implied about the nature of what the Ames team had been hunting across all the prior seasons, and what that thing's relationship to the human communities living in its territory actually was. To understand why the investigation Trapper identified as his most frightening encounter matters beyond its immediate evidence. It is necessary to understand the broader tradition within which the Ames team was operating, the Appalachian cultural and historical context that informed Trapper's understanding of what lived in those mountains and what its presence meant for the people who shared that territory with it. The Appalachian mountain communities that Mountain Monsters drew its witness testimony from are not communities that discovered the creatures they described through the show's investigation process. They are communities that have maintained continuous awareness of those creatures across generations of coexistence that has not always been peaceful, and that has produced a body of transmitted knowledge about the behavior, the capabilities, and the boundaries of the beings that inhabit the deep mountain terrain alongside the human population. That transmitted knowledge takes different forms in different communities. Some of it is embedded in the hunting and land use traditions of families that have worked specific sections of mountain territory for generations. Knowledge about which areas are avoided, which times of year bring increased signs of non-human presence, and what behaviors indicate that the boundary between the human and non-human territories is being approached or crossed. Some of it exists in the religious and spiritual frameworks that Appalachian mountain culture has developed across its history, frameworks that treat the presence of powerful non-human beings in the wilderness as a theological reality rather than a folkloric tradition, and that have specific doctrinal positions about the nature of those beings and the appropriate human relationship to them. Trapper was embedded in this tradition in a way that shaped every operational decision the Ames team made in the field. The locations he chose to investigate, the local sources he consulted before entering new territory, and the behavioral lines he established for the team during active hunts all reflected a knowledge base that went significantly deeper than anything the broadcast episodes made visible. The investigation he identified in his final days as his most frightening experience was frightening in part because of what it produced on camera, but it was frightening in larger part because of how what it produced on camera aligned with specific elements of the Appalachian traditional knowledge that Trapper had been carrying for decades, elements that he had hoped, across all the prior investigations, would not be confirmed in the direct and unambiguous form the evidence from that hunt produced. He had spent his career operating in the knowledge that the mountains contained something extraordinary. The investigation that scared him most was the one that told him specifically what that something was, and the answer aligned with the most serious and consequential interpretation of the Appalachian tradition, not the folkloric edge of it, but the theological core. The investigation Trapper identified as the most frightening of his career did not begin with any indication that it would end differently from the dozens of hunts the Ames team had conducted across the prior seasons. The location was in territory the team knew, a section of Appalachian mountain terrain that had generated consistent reports of anomalous creature activity across an extended period, and that had produced credible witness testimony from local sources whose relationship with Trapper gave their accounts a weight that anonymous reports would not have carried. The decision to investigate that specific location at that specific time was driven by an escalation in the reported activity that Trapper's local contacts had been describing over the preceding months, an escalation that was unusual not in the category of phenomenon being reported, but in its frequency and its proximity to the areas of human habitation at the edge of the deep mountain territory where the activity was normally concentrated. Something had moved closer. Whatever had been operating in the deep terrain of that mountain section was generating signs of its presence in areas it had not previously occupied, and the people living nearest to those areas were communicating a level of concern that Trapper took seriously, precisely because these were not people who communicated concern about mountain phenomena casually. The Ames team entered the investigation location in the early evening with their standard equipment configuration and the expectation that the elevated activity reports would translate into a productive investigation night. What they encountered within the first 2 hours exceeded the preliminary assessment of the location's activity level in ways that the team's prior experience in comparable terrain had not fully prepared them for. The signs of recent presence in the investigation area were not the ambiguous indicators that require expert interpretation to identify as significant. They were immediate and unmistakable, physical evidence of something large operating in the area within a time frame that placed its presence in the investigation zone concurrent with the team's arrival. The forest behavior was the first indicator that registered across the full team simultaneously. The ambient sound environment of a mountain forest at night is one that every member of the Ames team had extensive experience reading. The baseline of insect, bird, and small animal activity that provides a continuous acoustic map of what is and is not present in the surrounding terrain. That baseline shut down within 30 minutes of the team's entry into the investigation area in a pattern that Trapper later described as the most complete and rapid cessation of ambient sound he had experienced in decades of mountain fieldwork, not a gradual thinning of background noise as the team's presence registered with the wildlife in the surrounding area, a simultaneous and total shutdown that covered a radius of forest significantly larger than the team's immediate position, the kind of acoustic displacement that indicates the presence of something that the local wildlife recognizes as a predator of sufficient significance to trigger a unified silence response across multiple species at once. The footage from the investigation that Trapper identified as his most frightening experience documents a sequence of events across approximately 4 hours of active fieldwork that the Mountain Monsters production had never captured in any comparable form across the prior seasons of the show. The opening phase of the investigation footage is consistent with what the broadcast episodes had established as the show's standard field documentation. The team moving through the investigation area, calling out observations, responding to instrument readings, and establishing the baseline evidence picture before the active phase of the hunt began. What the cameras began capturing in the second hour of the investigation is where the footage diverges from anything in the show's prior record. The first significant moment documented on camera occurs without any dramatic buildup or visible trigger. A sudden and complete reorientation of every member of the Ames team toward the same direction simultaneously, without verbal communication between them, in response to something the audio track captures in the infrasound range below the threshold of comfortable human hearing. The team's physical response to that sound, the stiffening of posture, the immediate halt of all movement, the particular quality of stillness that experienced mountain hunters adopt when they have registered a predator stimulus, is visible on camera without any of the standard mountain monsters' dramatic framing around it. This was not a television reaction. The cameras then captured what happened when the team advanced toward the source of the infrasound. In the tree line approximately 80 yards from the team's position, movement became visible across multiple camera feeds simultaneously. Not the movement of a single entity passing through the frame, but a pattern of movement that indicated multiple presences repositioning in the dark timber in a coordinated manner that the team's experienced hunters recognized immediately as deliberate rather than incidental. What those multiple presences did over the following 90 minutes, the coordinated movement, the vocalizations that the audio equipment captured with a clarity and a complexity that exceeded anything the show had previously recorded, and the specific behavioral pattern that Trapper later described as the detail that frightened him most, is documented on camera in a form that left no member of the team with any ambiguity about what they were experiencing. The broadcast audience saw a version of that night. What they saw was not the version the cameras captured. Across 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters and decades of fieldwork in the Appalachian Mountains before the show existed, Trapper had developed a working understanding of the behavioral boundaries that defined his relationship with whatever inhabited the deep mountain territory his team investigated. Those boundaries had held across every prior investigation, an implicit negotiation between the human presence of the Ames team and the non-human presence of the creatures they were hunting, in which both parties maintained a specific distance that neither crossed without the investigation reaching a natural conclusion. The moment Trapper identified in his final days as the moment that frightened him most was the moment during the investigation documented in this video when that boundary was crossed. Not by the Ames team advancing further into the territory of whatever they were hunting. By whatever they were hunting, advancing into theirs. The cameras documented the moment the coordinated presences in the tree line began moving toward the team's position, rather than maintaining the parallel tracking behavior they had been exhibiting across the prior portion of the investigation. Trapper's response to that movement, visible on camera before any verbal communication between team members, was the response of a man whose decades of experience in those mountains had just told him something that his prior experience had not prepared him to process in real time. He had spent years operating on the understanding that the creatures the Ames team hunted were aware of the human investigators in their territory, were capable of monitoring and responding to that presence with a sophistication that went beyond animal instinct, and maintained a consistent behavioral pattern of avoidance that kept the investigations within a range of danger his experience could account for. What advanced out of that tree line toward the team's position that night was not behaving within that pattern, and what Trapper saw in the quality of that advance, in the deliberateness of it, the patience of it, and the specific directional intention it communicated, was the detail he referenced in his final days as the thing he could never fully set aside after that investigation was over. It was not the size of what came toward them, it was not the speed, it was the intelligence the advance communicated, an intelligence that understood exactly what the Ames team was, exactly what their equipment was capable of documenting, and exactly how close it could come before the investigation would break. It came to that line, and it held there, and it looked at Trapper with the full weight of something that had been in those mountains long before any human institution had been keeping records about what lived there. He never said what looked back at him from the dark, but in his final days he said that whatever it was, it knew him, and that it had known him for longer than he had known it. The question of why Trapper maintained silence about the investigation that scared him most across the years between when it occurred and his final days is not a simple one. The simplest component of the answer is the one that applies to any person operating within a television production framework: the contractual and institutional constraints that govern what cast members of a cable television show can and cannot say publicly about their experiences on that show and the evidence those experiences produced. Those constraints were real, and Trapper operated within them as every Mountain Monsters cast member did. But contractual constraint alone does not account for the specific character of the silence Trapper maintained about this investigation. He was not a man who found silence easy when he believed something important needed to be said, and across his public life he had demonstrated a willingness to push against institutional boundaries when the subject matter was significant enough to justify it. The silence about this investigation was different in character from the ordinary professional discretion he applied to the show's unreleased material. It was a silence that the people closest to him during the final years of his life have described as deliberate in a way that went beyond network compliance. A decision he had made about this specific investigation that was rooted not in contractual obligation, but in a personal reckoning with what the investigation had produced and what saying it publicly would mean. Part of that reckoning was theological. Trapper's relationship to the Appalachian religious tradition, the specific framework within which the communities he worked with understood the presence of powerful non-human beings in the mountain territory, had been shaped by a lifetime of encounter with evidence that pushed against the boundaries of what that framework could comfortably contain. The investigation that scared him most had pushed through those boundaries in a way that forced a personal confrontation with the most serious implications of what he believed about the nature of the things he had spent his career hunting. He was not ready to say those implications out loud for most of the years that followed the investigation. What changed in his final days was the same thing that changes the calculation for anyone approaching the end of their life about what they can afford to leave unsaid. The professional consequences of speaking no longer carried the weight they had. The personal reckoning he had been conducting privately about what the investigation meant and what it implied about the nature of the beings the Ames team had encountered across all the prior seasons had reached a conclusion, and the people he trusted most, the individuals who were present with him in those final days and who have shared his words in the time since, heard him say what he had spent years deciding how to say. He said it was real. He said it was not an animal. He said what came toward them that night in the tree line knew exactly what it was doing. And he said that the thing that frightened him most was not what it was. It was that it had always been there, and it had always known they were coming, and it had been deciding for a very long time how close it was willing to let them get. Something unprecedented just happened. Minutes ago, the remaining crew members of Mountain Monsters released a joint statement about an incident that's haunted them since 2019, an encounter so disturbing that it caused production to shut down for 8 months and left the team questioning whether they should continue hunting at all. For years, fans noticed something changed after Season 7. The energy was different. The crew seemed more cautious, more serious, less willing to venture into certain areas. Team members who used to charge fearlessly into the woods now hesitated at tree lines, and one location, a place they simply call the Hollow, was permanently marked as off-limits, with no explanation ever given, until now. The statement was posted simultaneously across all crew members' personal social media accounts, not the official show accounts, but their personal pages, suggesting this wasn't sanctioned by the network. The post was simple, direct, and chilling. "We need to tell you what really happened in the Hollow. We need to tell you why we almost quit. We need to tell you what followed us home. Before we go further, subscribe now if you're fascinated by cryptids and the unexplained, because what the Mountain Monsters crew is about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about what's lurking in Appalachia." The statement began with an apology from John Trapper Tice, the team leader who's been investigating Appalachian monsters for over 40 years. "We've always been honest with y'all about what we encounter out there," Trapper wrote, his usual confidence replaced with something heavier. "But there's one hunt we've never talked about, one creature we tracked that we can't explain, and one night that broke something in all of us." He was referring to March 2019, during what was supposed to be a routine investigation in the hills of southern West Virginia. The team had received reports of livestock mutilations, standard stuff for them. Farmers described finding cattle drained of blood with surgical precision cuts that didn't match any known predator. Worse, witnesses reported seeing something that walked on 2 legs, stood over 7 feet tall, and moved through the forest without making a sound. The crew assumed they were tracking a Grassman variant or possibly a rogue Sasquatch. They dealt with dozens of these investigations. This should have been straightforward. "We were wrong," Trapper wrote. "We were so damn wrong." The team, Trapper, Jeff, Willy, Wild Bill, and Huckleberry, arrived at the location on March 23, 2019, just after sunset. Local law enforcement had advised them not to go, which was unusual. Cops in Appalachia are generally supportive of the Ames team, often sharing information and helping with access to remote areas. But the sheriff who met them at the trailhead was different. He was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder at the tree line, and spoke in a low voice, as if afraid something might hear him. "You boys need to understand something," the sheriff told them, according to Wild Bill's account. "This ain't like your other hunts. People don't come back right from that hollow. Some don't come back at all." When Willy asked what he meant by "don't come back right," the sheriff just shook his head and walked away. But before he left, he turned back and said something that none of them forgot. "If you hear it calling your names, don't answer. No matter how much it sounds like someone you know, don't you dare answer." The team laughed it off at the time. They'd heard plenty of local superstitions, but as Jeff wrote in his portion of the statement, "We should have listened. God help us. We should have turned around right then." The first 3 hours of the investigation were normal. They set up thermal cameras, deployed motion sensors, and split into 2 groups to cover more ground. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no insects, no ambient wildlife sounds, but that often happened in areas with apex predators. Around 11:47 p.m., Huckleberry's radio crackled with Wild Bill's voice. "We got tracks, fresh ones. You need to see this." The team regrouped at Wild Bill's location, where they found prints unlike anything they'd encountered before. They were roughly humanoid, but wrong. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and the depth of the impression suggested something far heavier than a human but distributed differently than a bear or primate. The prints went deep, Willy explained in his statement. Real deep. Like whatever made them was carrying enormous weight. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. They were perfectly silent. We found tracks showing this thing had walked within 20 feet of our position, and none of us heard a damn thing. They followed the tracks deeper into the hollow, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. The trees grew denser, blocking out the moonlight. Their flashlight beams seemed to get swallowed by the darkness, not penetrating as far as they should. That's when Jeff heard his name. Jeffrey. It was his mother's voice, crystal clear, coming from deeper in the woods. The same tone she'd used when he was a child, calling him home for dinner. The problem? Jeff's mother had been dead for 3 years. "I froze," Jeff wrote. "Every rational part of my brain knew it wasn't real, knew my mama was gone, but it sounded exactly like her. Same voice, same inflection, same slight accent, and it was calling me home." Trapper grabbed Jeff's arm, stopping him from walking toward the voice. "Don't," Trapper said, remembering the sheriff's warning. But then they all heard it. Different voices, calling different names. Wild Bill heard his late father. Willy heard his ex-wife. Huckleberry heard his childhood best friend who died in a car accident in 1987. And Trapper heard something that made him go pale. He heard his own voice calling to him from the darkness. "It was me," Trapper wrote. "My voice, my words, my cadence, calling out to the team, telling them I'd found the creature, telling them to follow me deeper into the hollow. But I was standing right there. I wasn't the one talking. Something else was using my voice." The team huddled together, backs to each other, flashlights sweeping the tree line. The voices continued, growing more insistent, more desperate. Jeff's mother began pleading with him to come help her. She was hurt. She needed him. Wild Bill's father started getting angry, demanding to know why his son was ignoring him. Then the voices started overlapping, creating a chorus of the dead and the duplicated, all calling from the darkness. That's when Wild Bill's thermal camera picked up something that made him lower the device and stare at the screen in disbelief. "There were 7 heat signatures surrounding us," Wild Bill recounted. 7 human-shaped thermal readings, standing just beyond the tree line, completely still. We counted ourselves, 5 people. We were surrounded by something that was warm-blooded, man-sized, and perfectly motionless. Jeff made the decision to use the flare camera to get a better look. He raised it, aimed at the nearest signature, and looked through the viewfinder. What he saw made him drop the camera. "It looked like Trapper," Jeff wrote, his words conveying the horror even through text. "Standing there in the trees, wearing Trapper's clothes. Same build, same stance. But its head was tilted at an angle that wasn't right, and it was smiling. Not a human smile. Too wide, too many teeth, like something that had studied smiling but didn't understand the emotion behind it." Jeff spun around to confirm Trapper was still with the group. He was, standing right there, very much not smiling. But when Jeff looked back through the FLIR, the Trapper thing was closer. It had moved 15 feet in the 2 seconds Jeff had looked away, and it had done so in complete silence. "Run," Trapper commanded, and the team didn't question him. They ran back the way they came, or tried to. The trail had changed. Landmarks they'd noted on the way in were gone. The path they'd followed was no longer there, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked like it had been undisturbed for decades. Behind them, the voices followed, but now they were changing, distorting, Jeff's mother began speaking in his voice. Wild Bill's father started sounding like Willy. The voices were blending, shifting, learning. We realized it wasn't trying to lure us separately, Willy explained. It was learning us. Learning our voices, our patterns, our relationships. It was studying how we communicated so it could replicate us better. The team became disoriented in the darkness, unable to find their way out. Every direction looked the same. Every trail led in circles, and the thermal signatures kept appearing on their cameras, always just at the edge of visibility, always perfectly still until they looked away. Huckleberry, the team's tracker and navigator, made a disturbing discovery. We kept crossing our own footprints, he wrote, but some of the prints were facing the wrong direction, like we'd walked the same path backward, or like something else had been walking in our footsteps, matching our stride perfectly. At 2:33 a.m., they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones arranged in a pattern none of them recognized, and standing around the circle were the figures, all 7 of them. 5 looked like perfect copies of the team members. Same clothing, same equipment, same physical appearance, but something was wrong with their proportions. Their arms hung slightly too long, their necks bent at angles that suggested too many vertebrae. Their eyes reflected the flashlight beams like an animal's, bright and unnatural. The other 2 figures were incomplete. One had Trapper's face, but Wild Bill's body. The other had features that kept shifting, flickering between different team members as if it couldn't decide which one to mimic. They didn't attack us, Trapper wrote. They just stood there, watching, breathing in sync with us. When Jeff took a step back, his copy took a step back. When Willy raised his flashlight, his copy raised its arm at the exact same time. They were mirroring us, and I realized with absolute horror that they were waiting to get it right, waiting to perfect their imitation. Wild Bill, always the bravest and most impulsive, shouted at the creatures, "What the hell are you?" The Trapper copy tilted its head further, that too wide smile growing impossibly wider, and spoke in Trapper's exact voice. "We are what remains when you leave. We are what fills the space you occupied. We are the echo that doesn't fade." Then all 7 figures spoke in unison, using all 5 team members' voices simultaneously. "You've been here before. You'll be here again. You never really leave." That's when Huckleberry noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the stone circle, in the darkness beyond the clearing, were more figures, dozens of them. Some looked like hikers, wearing clothing from different decades. Some looked like hunters in old-fashioned gear. Some looked like people who'd been lost in these woods long ago, and they were all standing perfectly still, faces blank, eyes reflecting the light, waiting. "The Hollow collects," Trapper wrote. "That's what we understood in that moment. The Hollow collects people, not their bodies, but their patterns, their essence. It creates copies and keeps them there, trapped in a loop of existence, forever walking the same paths, forever calling out to new visitors, forever adding to its collection." The team ran again, this time with pure survival instinct overriding everything else. They crashed through underbrush, fell down slopes, ignored injuries and exhaustion. Behind them, they could hear footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, matching their pace perfectly. Jeff glanced back once and saw his own face running behind him, keeping pace, mirroring his movements exactly, except for that horrible wrong smile. They burst out of the tree line at 4:17 a.m., nearly 7 hours after they'd entered. Their vehicles were there, untouched, but something was wrong. The sheriff was still there, sitting in his patrol car, watching the woods. "You boys made it out," the sheriff said, but he didn't sound relieved. He sounded disappointed, resigned. "Most don't first time." "First time?" Willy demanded. "What the hell do you mean, first time?" The sheriff looked at each of them carefully, studying their faces, their mannerisms. "Just making sure all of you came back," he said cryptically. "Sometimes something else comes out wearing their faces. You can usually tell by the eyes. The copies never get the eyes quite right." He drove away without another word, leaving the team standing there, looking at each other with sudden suspicion and horror. How would they know if one of them wasn't really them anymore? The aftermath was worse than the encounter itself. "We all started experiencing the same thing," Jeff wrote. "We'd see ourselves, not in mirrors that we could dismiss as stress, but out in the world. I'd be at the grocery store and catch a glimpse of myself in the parking lot, standing perfectly still, watching me from between cars." Wild Bill said he saw himself standing in his backyard at 3 a.m. just staring at his house. Willy's neighbors asked why he was walking around his block at midnight when Willy had been asleep in bed. The team tried to return to normal filming, but the encounters continued. During a hunt in Kentucky 2 months later, Trapper's audio recorder picked up his own voice, whispering things he'd never said. In Tennessee, Huckleberry's motion-activated camera captured footage of Huckleberry walking past the camera, while Huckleberry was asleep in the tent 50 yards away. "We couldn't tell anyone," Trapper explained. "How do you explain to a production company that you might have brought something back, that there might be copies of us out there, getting better at imitating us, learning our lives, studying how to replace us?" The team consulted with experts, not cryptozoologists or paranormal investigators, but psychologists, neurologists, anyone who might explain what they were experiencing. The consensus was stress-induced hallucinations brought on by a shared traumatic experience. But then came the incident that forced them to speak out. 3 weeks ago, Jeff's wife called him in a panic. She'd been at home alone when she heard the front door open. She called out, thinking it was Jeff coming home early. Footsteps walked down the hall. She heard breathing outside the bedroom door. Then Jeff's voice, "Honey, I'm home." But Jeff was at a team meeting 3 hours away. He had witnesses. He was definitely not at home. His wife, terrified, locked herself in the bathroom and called the police. When officers arrived, they found the front door unlocked, muddy footprints leading down the hall to the bedroom door, then stopping. The prints matched Jeff's boots exactly. Same size, same wear pattern, same unique scuff on the left sole, but the prints didn't lead back out. They just stopped, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist at that spot. "That's when we knew we had to go public," Jeff wrote. "Because whatever came back with us from the hollow, it's not content to just watch anymore. It's getting closer. It's learning our homes, our families, our lives, and we don't know how to stop it." The crew's statement ended with a warning and a plea. "If you're planning to go into the Appalachian wilderness, especially the areas we've investigated, please reconsider," Trapper wrote. "And if you go anyway, follow these rules. Never go alone. Never answer if you hear your name called. Never follow voices that sound familiar. If you see someone you know standing too still or smiling wrong, turn around immediately. And most importantly, if you encounter something that looks exactly like someone in your group, make sure you can account for where that person actually is before you approach it." The statement concluded with something that sent chills through every fan who read it. "We've decided to continue hunting because something needs to document these creatures and warn people. But we're also continuing because we have to. Because whatever is in the hollow has part of us now. It knows us, it can find us, and the only way we stay ahead of it is by staying together, by staying alert, and by never ever going back to that place. We just hope we all stay us." Within minutes of the statement being posted, the comments exploded. Hundreds of people reported similar experiences in Appalachia. Hikers who'd seen their own doppelgangers on trails. Campers who'd heard their voices calling from the woods when they were safely in their tents. Hunters who'd encountered something that looked like their partner but moved wrong, spoke wrong, smiled wrong. One comment stood out, posted by a user with no profile picture and an account created minutes before. "The Hollow thanks you for the introduction. Your faces have been very useful. We're getting better at wearing them." The comment was deleted within seconds, but not before dozens of people screenshot it. The account vanished entirely, as if it had never existed. And then, this morning, something else happened. A hiker in West Virginia posted a trail camera photo to social media. The camera had been set up to capture wildlife near a remote trail. In the photo, standing in a perfect line on the trail, were 5 figures. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their silhouettes matched the Mountain Monsters team exactly. Same heights, same builds, same postures. But according to the timestamp, the photo was taken yesterday, and according to the team's social media, they were all at a convention in Pennsylvania yesterday, 300 miles away. One commenter enhanced the image, zooming in on the figures' faces. The resolution was poor, pixelated, but you could make out enough detail to see one thing clearly. All 5 figures were smiling, the same too-wide smile, the same wrong expression, and they were looking directly at the camera as if they knew it was there, as if they wanted to be seen, as if they were ready. The Mountain Monsters crew has broken their silence, but in doing so, they may have revealed something worse. Whatever is in the hollow isn't content to stay there. It's patient, it's learning, it's waiting for the right moment to step out of the forest and into the lives of the people it's been studying. And the question that haunts everyone who's read their statement is simple but terrifying. How many of the people walking around are actually people? How many are copies, echoes, things that learned to wear human faces and are now living human lives, while the originals are still trapped somewhere in the darkness, calling out names that will never be answered? The crew wanted to break their silence. They wanted to warn people. But in revealing what happened in the hollow, they may have also revealed that it's already too late, that whatever followed them out is already here, already among us, already perfecting its disguise. And maybe, just maybe, the crew members who posted that statement aren't the real ones anymore. Maybe the real Trapper, Jeff, Willy, Wild Bill, and Huckleberry are still in the hollow, still trapped, still watching their copies live their lives. How would we even know? If this story disturbed you, subscribe and share this video. Let us know in the comments if you've ever encountered your own doppelganger or heard your voice calling from somewhere you weren't. And if you ever go hiking in Appalachia, remember the crew's warning. Some things in those mountains don't just watch, they learn. They copy, they wait, and sometimes they come home with you. The Mountain Monsters crew broke their silence, but maybe silence would have been safer, because now, whatever is out there knows we're talking about it. And if there's one thing that's become clear from their statement, it's this. The things in the hollow don't like being ignored, but they love being acknowledged. And we just gave them all the acknowledgement they needed.